Hi there. Welcome to another online video lesson intended to provide you important principles and helpful tips for the study and practice of argumentation. This video is the second in a four-part series looking at argument prototypes. In other words, recurrent forms of argumentative reasoning that we encounter time and time again throughout our exposure to human arguments. If we can identify these prototypes of reasoning when we run across them, we'll be in a much better position to evaluate their logical effectiveness. This is going to be the first of three videos that look specifically at what are referred to as substantive warrant prototypes, arguments from cause and arguments from sign. Along the way, we're also going to get some experience applying tests for evaluating cause warrants and sign warrants in order to evaluate their logical soundness. But first, we need to review a couple of important points from last time. Brock-Reedy and Enninger, in their 1960 article that introduced Stephen Toulmin's argumentation theory to the U.S. speech communication community, defined argument prototypes like this. We may classify arguments by recognizing the possible routes which the warrant may travel in performing its function. What we want to talk about for the next couple of videos is what they referred to as patterns that they identify as substantive warrants. Quote, an arguer may carry data to claim by means of an assumption concerning the relationship existing among phenomena in the external world. In other words, certain types of reasoning say something about a specific kind of relationship between what we see in the data of an argument and what we see in the claim of an argument. And if we can recognize those data claim relationship patterns, we can identify what sort of warrant is being used, even if it's only implied, and then we can start applying critical tests in order to evaluate the argument. Let's start off with the first of the two prototypes that we're going to examine in this video, argument from cause. Brock-Reedy and Enninger define it as follows. The warrant attributes to facts a creative or generative power and specifies the nature of the effect they will produce. In other words, according to Inch and Tudor in their textbook on argument, arguments from cause claim that one condition or event contributes to or brings about another condition or event. We're all very familiar with arguments from cause. They're used all the time, from our most mundane, everyday arguments to the most crucial of public controversies. Let's take a look at an example of a causal argument that is at the heart of one of the central public policy controversies of our time, and that is the battle between gun ownership rights and calls for stricter gun control as a response to gun violence, and specifically the tragedy of mass shootings. President Barack Obama had to respond to yet another school shooting, this time at a community college in Roseburg, Oregon. In the speech, he emphasizes in at least a couple of places a centrally important causal argument that reinforces his larger policy proposal to engage in the passage of stricter gun control legislation. Let's take a look at an excerpt from the speech.
We don't yet know why this individual did what he did. And it's fair to say that anybody who does this has a sickness in their minds, regardless of what they think their motivations may be. But we are not the only country on earth that has people with mental illnesses or want to do harm to other people. We are the only advanced country on earth that sees these kinds of mass shootings every few months. Earlier this year I answered a question in an interview by saying the United States of America is the one advanced nation on earth in which we do not have sufficient common sense gun safety laws, even in the face of repeated mass killings. And later that day, there was a mass shooting at a movie theater in Lafayette, Louisiana. That day. We know that states with the most gun laws tend to have the fewest gun deaths. So the notion that gun laws don't work or just will make it harder for law-abiding citizens and criminals will still get their guns, it's not borne out by the evidence. We know that other countries, in response to one mass shooting, have been able to craft laws that almost eliminate mass shootings. Friends of ours, allies of ours, Great Britain, Australia, countries like ours. So we know there are ways to prevent it.
When we apply a simple Toulmin diagram analysis to the argument, this is what we come up with. President Obama makes a claim. Stricter gun control laws would reduce mass shootings. Now, how does he support this claim with his data or his evidence? Well, at one point in the speech, he provides a couple of specific data points. First of all, he draws a distinction between the United States and other nations that's in direct response to a common criticism of gun control recommendations that basically takes the following form. The reason why we have such mass shootings in the United States is not because of our gun policy, but because we don't effectively deal with mental illness. So Obama makes a first point. Other nations have violently mentally ill people, but no other nation has our frequency of mass shootings. So he draws that important distinction. One thing that makes the United States unique is we have far more mass shootings than anybody else on the planet. The second distinction that he makes, making the United States unique, is when he says that we are the only advanced nation without common sense gun control laws. And so how do we get from these distinctions about the United States to the claim that stricter gun control laws would reduce mass shootings? It relies on this implicit causal warrant. Easy access to guns and not mental illness causes increased incidence of mass shootings. And so he identifies here what he wants us to think of as the primary causal linchpin that leads to gun violence in our society, and particularly the epidemic of mass shootings. Easy access to guns puts guns in the hands of lots of people who really shouldn't have guns in the first place, and that's what causes so many mass shootings when other nations don't have them. And the reason why other nations don't have them is that they have stricter, quote-unquote, common sense gun control laws, and it's these stricter laws that lead to a reduction in mass shootings. He reinforces this causal relationship with a second instance of this kind of argument. Again, he makes a claim, stronger gun control laws will reduce the level of gun violence. In this part of the speech, he provides some additional evidence. First of all, he points out that the states with the strongest gun control laws tend to have the least amount of gun violence. And secondly, he points out that advanced nations like Great Britain and Australia have nearly eliminated mass shootings with strong gun control laws. So in this instance, he's using a very similar implied causal warrant. Easy access to guns increases gun violence, while stricter access reduces gun violence. With this evidence, he provides a relatively compelling relationship between the strictness of the laws and the amount of violence. And so it's this relationship between strictness of laws and amount of gun violence, plus the causal warrant, that leads Obama to his claim that if we strengthen gun control laws, we'll reduce the level of gun violence. Okay, so we understand from an analytical standpoint how this argument is structured and how the causal warrant is supposed to operate. So how do we evaluate whether this is a logical use of causal reasoning? Well, what we have to recall from our previous video is that Brock-Reedy and Enninger point out that for whatever kind of warrant we're testing, there's three broad categories of tests that we can use in order to draw some critical conclusions about the logical soundness of a warrant. First, the test of quality. Is the connection between the data and the claim that the warrant is expressing actually relevant? Does it make a connection between data and claim that authorizes an inferential leap that makes sense? Secondly, the test of quantity. Put simply, is there enough information to go on between what we have in the data or the evidence of the argument, as well as perhaps any backing that's provided to substantiate the warrant? Do we have enough information to rely on the reasonableness of the warrant? And finally, the test of opposition. Do we have sufficient exceptional circumstances or conditions in the situation that might outweigh the rule that's established by the warrant? So in other words, the data might be true and the warrant potentially might make sense, but there's still reasons why the claim would be false. Now, how do you apply these three kinds of tests when we're talking about causal reasoning? Well, first of all, the test of quality. Are the conditions in the data necessary to cause the condition in the claim? If we have a particular effect that we're looking at, in this case, gun violence, Do you need to have access to guns in order to be able to have gun violence? The test of quantity, though, pushes things a little bit further. Are the conditions in the data sufficient in number to cause the condition in the claim? So in other words, is access to guns by itself enough to cause the condition of high levels of gun violence, particularly mass shootings? And finally, the test of opposition. Are there alternate causes for the condition in the claim present? So in other words, just because there's easy access to guns, could there be other sorts of factors besides the state of the gun control laws that might be contributing to mass shootings and other high levels of gun violence? At the same time, the test of opposition might also ask about counter causes that would be present, that might indicate the absence or opposite of the condition in the claim. In other words, even if there might be a causal relationship between lax gun control laws and higher levels of gun violence, could there be other things going on in the situation that might mitigate that effect? So in fact, the effect of increased gun violence might not actually be happening. Well, let's go back to the argument. In the first instance, Obama points out the uniqueness of the United States, both in terms of the frequency of our mass shootings, as well as our relative lack of what he refers to as common sense gun laws. And so what we have to ask ourselves is the lack of common sense gun laws a necessary condition in order to increase mass shootings, such that if we increase the strictness of gun control laws, we would actually reduce the mass shootings? Well, at this point in the argument, we don't have a whole lot to go on. He's making a causal warrant that easy access to guns and not mental illness causes increased mass shootings. Now, on one level, the test of quality, access to guns is absolutely necessary in order to engage in gun violence. You can't do a mass shooting without a gun. However, if we go to the test of quantity, is easy access to a gun all by itself sufficient to cause high rates of gun violence and high numbers of mass shootings? And this is where we might need a bit more contextual evidence, because as opponents to Obama's claim might point out, applying a test of opposition, there could be a possible alternative cause going on. Notice what Obama puts in his first data point. Other nations have violently mentally ill people, but no other nation has our frequency of mass shootings. Now, Obama is holding that that's because we provide easy access to people that shouldn't have guns because they're mentally ill. But one might point out that, well, perhaps the alternate causality is not necessarily the easy access to guns, but the fact that while we do have mentally ill people in our society just like other nations do, perhaps our nation isn't dealing with our violently mentally ill as effectively as other nations might be. Perhaps we need to do more in the area of proactive, preventative care, as well as being able to provide the treatment to the mentally ill that would enable them to ultimately avoid these kinds of behaviors. So that might be an application of the test of opposition. Yes, we have easy access to guns, but there could be other reasons why we have the high crime and other reasons why we have the mass shootings. So right now, the test of quantity isn't necessarily giving us enough information to foreclose that alternate cause and really hone in on what Obama wants us to think the primary cause is. That's why we need to go to the next argument. In this argument, we have additional information that, when piled on top of the previous argument, gives the test of quantity a little bit more to be satisfied with. So the warrant is, of course, very similar to the previous one. Easy access to guns makes gun violence more possible, whereas guns in fewer hands would reduce the possibility of gun violence. Now, to shore up the reasonableness of this warrant, Obama provides a couple of important comparisons. With regard to the states with the strongest gun control laws, as well as with regard to advanced nations that have stronger gun control laws and nearly eliminated their mass shootings, he provides a much more compelling causal relationship. That if you have strong laws, the violence level goes down. And so if we don't have strong laws, but we make our laws stronger, perhaps we too can reduce the level of gun violence in much the same way as the states with the strongest laws, as well as our allies like Great Britain and Australia. So with additional information that has a stronger factual foundation, as opposed to just the coincidence of the laws that we have and the fact that we have mass shootings, the causal reasoning becomes more logically persuasive given these comparisons that are based in statistical data rather than just a simple comparison. Okay. So that's how we can understand what a causal argument looks like and the way in which we would test the logic behind a causal prototype. Are the conditions necessary to cause the condition in the claim? Are the conditions sufficient in number to cause the condition in the claim? Could there be alternate causes for the condition in the claim? Or might there be counter causes that might actually tell us that the condition being asserted in the claim really isn't the effect that it's being claimed to be? Okay. As we move from causal warrants to the next kind of argument prototype, it's going to be important to note that these arguments are going to seem very similar, although they have a very important logical difference. So let's start talking about argument from sign. Brockreedy and Enninger define it as follows. The data consist of clues. The warrant interprets the meaning of these symptoms. The claim affirms that something possesses the attributes of which the clues are symptomatic. This is the way, for instance, that doctors diagnose diseases, right? You go into the doctor and they take your temperature and they look at the spots on your face and they see if there's a coating on your tongue and they run a blood test. And when they find those various clues and symptoms and they pull them all together, the doctors then make their best possible educated guess based on the medical science. This is the condition that you have. We can't see that condition, but we can see the symptoms and clues. The other way, of course, to think about argument from sign is even simpler than that. Where there's smoke, there's fire. You're driving down the highway and you see a plume of smoke on the horizon. Now, you can't see the fire, but you know that smoke, which is the visual clue, generally provides an indication that fire is present because fire causes smoke to happen. Now, here's where we don't want to get tripped up. When we're arguing from sign, we are not arguing from cause, right? Because smoke can happen not just because a fire is burning, but perhaps because a fire already burned, the fire is out, but the smoke still continues. Or, of course, in some instances, smoke can happen from a variety of other circumstances. Maybe from a smoke machine, or maybe what we think is smoke is actually steam from a factory pipe. So we're not talking about a factual cause to effect relationship, but we're talking about observing a clue, and from seeing that clue, we draw a conclusion that something else that we can't see is actually present. Inch and Tudor talk about this kind of argument as coexistential argument, which reasons from something that can be observed, a sign, to a condition or feature that cannot be observed. So it's important to note, as we're sorting out these definitions, in case you're getting confused, that argument from sign and coexistential argument are the same thing. They're two different terms talking about the same kind of logical reasoning. Okay, so let's consider an example of how this works in a way that we can have some fun. I want to point you to the BBC's recent adaptation of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. As we know, Sherlock Holmes is a master of observation. He can see things in the surrounding environment and draw conclusions about what's going on that many of the rest of us are going to miss. In this clip, we're going to see Sherlock joining the police from Scotland Yard, coming upon a deceased person who has died from a gunshot wound to the head. From all indications immediately at the scene, the officer concludes that this is the victim of a suicide because it appears to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. However, Sherlock isn't convinced.
We're obviously looking at a suicide.
It does seem the only explanation of all the facts.
Wrong. It's one possible explanation of some of the facts. You've got a solution that you like, but you're choosing to ignore anything you see that doesn't comply with it.
Like?
The wound's on the right side of his head.
And?
Bancoon was left-handed. Requires quite a bit of contortion.
Left-handed?
I'm amazed you didn't notice. All you have to do is look around this flat. Coffee table on the left-hand side, coffee mug handle pointing to the left. Power sockets habitually use the ones on the left. Pen and paper on the left-hand side of the phone because he picked it up with his right and took down messages with his left. You want me to go on?
No, I think you've covered it.
I might as well. I'm almost at the bottom of the list. There's a knife on the breadboard with butter on the right side of the blade. Because he used it with his left, it's highly unlikely that a left-handed man would shoot himself in the right side of his head. Conclusion, someone broke in here and murdered him. Only explanation of all of the facts.
But
Okay, so just in case following very rapidly spoken British dialect is something that's a little difficult for you, as it is for me sometimes, let's break this down with a simple Toulmin diagram. Sherlock draws the following conclusion. The victim of this crime was a left-handed person. Now, this victim is dead. Nobody there knows the person and can provide us confirmation that he was in fact a left-handed person. So how does Sherlock draw this conclusion? He looks to the signs, the clues that are available in the room. There are numerous objects throughout the victim's home that are either placed in a position or otherwise show signs of being used by a left-handed person. And so, given this observation and this observation and this observation and this observation that all seem to indicate the same thing, Sherlock uses the implied warrant that the objects and their placement and their apparent use indicate that their owner is left-handed. We're using the visible signs, the clues or the symptoms or the indications in order to draw a conclusion about a condition that we cannot see, that while this person was alive, they were left-handed. Incidentally, if you're wondering about how we get from the fact that this person was left-handed to his ultimate conclusion that this person was murdered, well, that gets into deductive reasoning, and you'll need to wait for the next video in this series to figure out how that works. There's your teaser. So this example was kind of fun. Let's go back to an example a little bit more serious by going back to President Obama's 2015 speech in response to the Roseburg, Oregon school shooting. One of the things that he does in the speech is he draws a conclusion about the emotional and psychological state of the nation that somehow is impeding progress on making legislative advances in the area of gun control and safety against violent crime and school shootings. Let's see how he does it.
Somehow this has become routine. The reporting is routine. My response here at this podium ends up being routine. The conversation in the aftermath of it, we've become numb to this. We talked about this after Columbine and Blacksburg, after Tucson, after Newtown, after Aurora, after Charleston. It cannot be this easy for somebody who wants to inflict harm on other people to get his or her hands on a gun.
So in this brief moment of argument, Obama makes some observations, symptoms, if you will, of what's wrong with the nation. He describes how our responses to mass shootings have become routine. The things that we say after the shootings are routine, the news coverage is routine, the president's responses are routine, the responses of the opposition are routine, and so on and so forth. He describes the situation where everybody just goes through the motions and does the same thing, even though another horrific thing has just happened. And the conclusion that he draws from this is that we as a nation have become, his word was numb, or desensitized to mass shootings. And the implicit warrant here is that routine responses to horrible events indicate social desensitization. Essentially, he's arguing that what explains the fact that when this horrifically tragic and awful thing happens, we just plod through and do the same things that we always do whenever this kind of thing happens. Where is the outrage? Where is the massive grief? The fact that we're just responding in a routine way indicates that somehow we've checked out, that we're numb to these things. Heaven forbid we're getting used to it in our nation. And so because we're desensitized, as he goes on to argue, there isn't sufficient motivation to actually try to do something to solve the problem. Okay, so if we see how the sign argument works, now let's get to how do you evaluate an argument like this logically? So let's go to our tests. The test of quality for a sign argument is the relationship between the indication or the sign and the condition constant and reciprocal. In other words, when you see smoke, will you always see fire? When you see fire, will you always see smoke? The test of quantity. Are the indications or signs sufficient in number to infer the existence of the condition? Do we have enough clues? Do we have enough symptoms or observations so that we can draw a conclusion about this unseen condition with some confidence? And finally, the test of opposition. Are there countersigns present that would indicate the absence or the opposite of the condition in the claim? So even if there are some signs or clues that point in one direction, could we find other clues or symptoms that point in a different direction that would result in a different kind of condition than the one that's being described in the claim? Let's take these tests and let's apply them to President Obama's argument. The test of quality is going to ask if we have a constant and reciprocal relationship between the clues or the symptoms in the data and the unobserved condition in the claim. Well, let's see. Responses to a violent event are routine. So when you see routine responses to a violent event, does that indicate being desensitized? And if we are numb or desensitized, is that always accompanied by routine responses and behaviors? And there seems to be some sense, based on most of our practical experience in these emotional matters, that these things do tend to go along together a bit. When we're numbed, when we're desensitized, when we're not really reacting in strong ways to things, we can behave in a way that is routine and patterned. We don't do things out of the ordinary because we're not having an out of the ordinary reaction to these events. So on that level, it makes sense. However, even though the test of quality might be okay in this instance, we have to apply the test of quantity and the test of opposition. Do we have enough clues to go on? And are there any countersigns in the opposite direction? Well, there might not be any countersigns in this direction because, in the speech at least, President Obama doesn't provide any specific indication to suggest that there are a lot of people that are having any extreme emotional reactions to the situation. He talks about the grief of the loved ones of those who lost their lives, as well as the grief of the nation as a whole, but he doesn't really get into whether or not there are other kinds of reactions. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that more extreme reactions aren't taking place. And so if through some contextual research you were to discover that, well, no, in fact, there are lots of indications that there are people that are not numb and desensitized, but in fact, they're outraged and grief-stricken and demanding that things are being done. So that's going to take some more contextual information. What might be a little bit simpler just by looking at the symptoms and drawing a conclusion is going to be how we assess the test of quantity. So we observe that we're engaged in routine patterned responses to this kind of event. So does that necessarily indicate the presence of a numb or desensitized emotional condition? Well, it could, but engaged in a thought experiment, could it provide a symptom or a clue of some other kind of condition? For instance, a horrific level of intense, extreme grief. If we're so emotionally wrecked that the only way that we can cope with it is by engaging in routine pattern behavior, just going through the motions, that would explain the kind of behavior that President Obama is talking about as well. So while it may be the case that our patterned routine behaviors indicate that we as a nation have become numb and desensitized, it could also mean that we as a nation are in profound, amazing levels of grief and denial, which is a very different condition, emotionally and psychologically speaking. So if the president wanted to make the case that in fact the nation is not emotionally wrecked and incapable of action, but in fact has been lulled into a sense of being desensitized and complacent, we might want to try to identify a few more clues or symptoms in order to be ultimately convinced. So that's how we would apply the tests of quality, quantity, and opposition for signed warrants. Do we have a constant and reciprocal relationship between the clues and the condition? Do we have enough clues that give us a confident sense that we can infer the existence of the unobserved condition? And finally, are there other kinds of clues or symptoms that might indicate that in fact some other kind of condition that isn't being reflected in the claim might actually be going on? So that's the end of this lesson. If you've got any questions about cause or sign arguments, what they look like, how you can analyze them, and especially how you can apply the tests to evaluate them, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time for more fun with argument prototypes.